Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Hello, I'm Frances Hayes, DWFI Director of Communications and Public Relations, and your host for this episode of the Water for Food podcast. I'm joined today by two of our faculty fellows, Andrea Basche, Associate Professor in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture, and Tonya Haigh, a Research Assistant Professor, Social Science Coordinator, and Project Coordinator for the National Drought Mitigation Center, as well as Jesse Bell, who leads the Water, Climate, and Health program at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and is also a part of the leadership team here at DWFI. While their expertise varies quite a bit, all three contributed to the recently released 5th National Climate Assessment. Federally mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990, the National Climate Assessment is released every 5 years to serve as the foremost review of research on the current and future impacts of climate change in the United States. The assessment includes around 450 authors and 850 total collaborators. Andrea and Tonya were co-authors for the chapter covering the Northern Great Plains, which includes Nebraska. These regional chapters provide detailed discussions of region-specific challenges, opportunities, and success stories for managing risks and impacts of climate change. Jesse was a co-author for the chapter on human health, part of the section on national topics, which summarizes current and future risks related to climate change and what can be done to reduce those risks for a variety of societal and economic sectors of the United States. Andrea, Tonya, and Jesse, I'm really glad we could find some time for all of you to come together virtually, and I'm excited to learn more about your work on this publication. So let's get started. To kick us off, tell us a little bit about each of your expertise, how you got involved as an author for this report, and what all your role entailed.
Sure, I can kick it off. And so I'm Jesse Bell. And as mentioned, I'm faculty at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, University of Nebraska Medical Center. My expertise is actually, for a long time, I've been studying the impacts of environmental change and climate change and how it impacts human health. And even before that, I was studying and trying to understand the impacts of climate change on the environment, just broadly. And over time, I kind of changed focus because I became very interested in understanding that those changes in the environment and those changes in our climate system and what that actually means to human health. And so I originally started out working at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, through a cooperative institute there. And then eventually I started working at CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So that's a little bit about me, just in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jesse. Tonya, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so at the National Drought Mitigation Center, I have worked quite a lot with agricultural producers and communities on their strategies for managing and adapting to drought. So my background is in the social sciences, so that's where I'm coming at this from. And I was invited to co-author the Northern Great Plains chapter, really to contribute to in that way. So to the ways that are resource dependent and our land-based livelihoods in this region are at risk of climate change currently as well in the future, and strategies for how we're adapting and managing those risks.
Great, thanks. And Andrea, tell us how you're involved.
Yeah, thanks, Frances, for bringing us together for this opportunity to highlight its issues of importance from the National Climate Assessment for the listeners. So Andrea Basche, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture, and my education background is in agronomy, sustainable agriculture, and also applied climate science. So my research focus now is on diversified cropping systems and those that I describe as offering continuous living cover of our land. So that is not perhaps explicitly about climate, but I understand that these approaches to crop management, practices like cover crops or perennial crops, they can prevent soil erosion, improve water holding capacity of the soil, offer a lot of benefits, improving profitability of farmers. They offer a lot of important climate adaptation approaches. So really our work is in agronomy, but thinking about the current and future challenges of climate. And so because of my climate background and that I'm often invited to be a part of climate related events with climate and agriculture, I was invited to be a part of the National Climate Assessment and contributed more specifically in the agriculture and adaptation sections of the Northern Great Plains chapter.
And actually, I can jump in here because I only answered part of your question, Francis. So I apologize for that.
No problem.
The other part is, how did I get involved in this? I've been, because I've been working in around climate and health for a long time. I was actually previously on the U.S. GCRP, which is a Global Change Research Program. There was an interim report between two of the national climate assessments, previous national climate assessments, that was focused just solely on health. And so I was one of the lead authors on that report and was responsible for help bringing that forward. And so that was one of the first comprehensive federal reports to really focus on how climate change impacts human health. And so after getting done with that report, I would need a little bit of time off, and they were moving into the fourth climate assessment. So I stepped away and decided I didn't want to work on that assessment at that time. But then when this one came about, because there has been quite a few advances in that space around climate and health, I thought this was a good opportunity for me to kind of step back in and try to add some more of my expertise. And so I volunteered and was very fortunate to be accepted to be part of the team on the health chapter.
Great. Thanks for adding that, Jesse. And I think it's really neat that there are three of you and more actually from the University of Nebraska system and connected institutes that participated in that. I think that, really says a lot for the university that all three of you were invited. Plus there are some others, I think, that serve on it as well. So that's a big win. This assessment is very long. It's over 30 chapters of some great content, but I just now want to focus on some of the key findings of the report. And if you just want to focus on the chapters you co-authored, that's totally fine. As I said, there's a lot to unpack in this report, but what are some of those key findings and how do they compare to previous assessments? Are there anything in particular that is different this time than last time?
I can start. I'd like to kind of underscore the point that you alluded to in your introduction, Francis, which is that the National Climate Assessment is always meant to be a comprehensive assessment of current research. So since the last report, this is an update from the prior report. So the prior report came out in November of 2018. And I also want to underscore, too, that this work comes together over a series of years. We started meeting as a team, 2.5 years before that report was released. And that's many discussions and a lot of coming to consensus about what should be included. And it's reviewing the literature, thinking about news and things that happened in the time since the last report. So Tonya and I, being in Eastern Nebraska, certainly made a point to say we need to mention the 2019 flooding that happened in the state because that was really impactful, just as an example, right? So there's review of literature, thinking about events that have happened, discussion and consensus building with a broad group of authors and contributors, and also phases of public comment. So there's a lot that goes into just what topics are selected. And I would say my memory, it does go back to 2021 when we started the report. And I remember just at a national level, and I'd love to hear if Jesse and Tonya have other thoughts on this, an emphasis on the urgency of the challenges and the impacts of the challenges. And so you'll see in the first chapter of the report just a recognition that future change depends on the decisions that we make now and the urgency of mitigation and adaptation. And then one other thing I'll say that might be new is that, or a difference in this report, that there was really from the USGCRP, the group that coordinates the report, a request and a request for a more intentional emphasis on the inequities that are created via climate change, that it's often the people and the communities with less ability to cope or who are already marginalized in some way who will be impacted the most, right? So we had this directive to kind of include that in all chapters. And one new thing in the NCA 5 is that there's a separate chapter dedicated exclusively to social systems and justice. So that's kind of my thought about some of the things that are new in this assessment.
Yeah, and I would jump in and definitely second that and add to that in that the focus on the social systems has probably increased a lot in this report. There's also more of a focus on traditional indigenous knowledge approaches to climate adaptation and how those years of how that accumulated knowledge can really help inform climate adaptation approaches. And then I think one of the other things we've seen is really more examples, a growing number of examples of adaptation in practice. So at the community level, at the state level, what can we learn about what's happening with both climate mitigation and adaptation, and learn from one another. So those are some of the things that I was really happy to see in this report.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, these reports, they come out on a pretty regular basis. Like you were saying, they're congressionally mandated so that we can have a thorough assessment of how climate is impacting the United States as a whole. And, one of my takeaways with each one of these reports, it only solidifies kind of our basic knowledge around this. We understand that our climate system is changing. We understand that over the last 50 to 100 years, we've experienced changes in our climate system. And as we're moving forward, those changes will continue. With that being an increase in temperature, changes in extreme precipitation, and other extreme weather events, the science is only becoming steadily stronger in understanding these relationships. It's not like all of a sudden we've started this new report and we're like, oh, scrap all of that stuff that we've learned. We've got something completely new. It's really the accumulation of knowledge that we've been able to build on those previous reports. And then, when we look at the health piece, for example, with that, there has been more information, more knowledge that's been gained on understanding some of the impacts. When we first did the report in 2016 that was focused just on climate and health, one of the first things that we said was climate change is a significant threat to the health of the American people. And that's a very similar statement with our key message, the health chapter for this one as well. And the reason that we can say that is that we live in a changed climate system. We're seeing, increases in temperature, changes in extreme heat events, changes in precipitation patterns, extreme weather, and all of these things can potentially impact human health. And we're not fully understanding of all those impacts now. And so as we move forward, as our system continues to change, these impacts are only going to be more significant if we don't better understand them now. And then I think on some of those inequities that Andrea and Tonya were talking about that I think are so important is that was our second key message for the health chapter, which was talking about how systematic racism and discrimination exacerbate climate-related health impacts. Because we understand that certain populations are more at risk to the impacts associated with climate change. And you can see that in almost any community that you live in. Some people live in floodplains, some people don't. So when flooding happens, it's those communities that are more impacted. Outdoor workers, for example, and typically in floodplains, it's low-income populations a lot of times that live in those areas. Outdoor workers are more susceptible to a lot of environmental exposures as well. And so, when we think of it, we typically think of it in like four broad categories. It's individuals of color, communities of color, low-income individual or low-income individuals, low-income communities, elderly or older populations, and then also children. These are typically the most at-risk populations associated with climate change or any disaster, especially climate-related disaster. And so that's one of the pieces within this as well. And that was kind of our key message for 3, is thinking about how to do adaptation and mitigation to protect human health. And that's where also there's opportunities for success, and there's opportunities for addressing some of these issues. Even as our climate will continue to change, there's opportunities to get in there and actually do things now that builds resilience within our communities to make sure that we have stronger communities for the future.
Well, thank you to all of you for your insight. I think that really sets us up for the purpose of the assessment overall, and why you spend so much time putting it all together. I imagine it's hard to coordinate that many authors and that many chapters. So kudos to you. So Andrea and Tonya, now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the chapter that you both contributed to. And as a true Nebraskan, I was a little taken aback to see Nebraska appearing in the Northern Great Plains chapter instead of the Midwest chapter, as I always claim myself as a Midwesterner, but I'll leave that official designation to the experts and leave my personal opinions aside.
We're in a transition zone, which is something that is unique about Nebraska, especially Eastern Nebraska. So it's okay, Frances, if you feel disappointed.
Well, thanks for that. So can you share some of the ways in which the Northern Great Plains may differ from other regions, especially when it comes to the effects of climate change? Why did the assessment, go through and look at the climate effects by region, and how do the impacts differ by region?
Right. And one thing I think that's important to know that's different, it's just this joke we're making about, are we in Nebraska, the Midwest, or the Great Plains? We can be centric to, the population and land use, let's say, of Eastern Nebraska, but really the Great Plains is much broader than that. And I think that is something that is different, that because our region encompasses Nebraska, the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, it does have a lot of variability in terms of impacts from east to west. And so just that variability of what trends will be experienced across the U.S. is why these regional chapters are really important. And so I encourage anyone who's really interested in this, just as a side note, there's so much great information in the report. The reports are organized around key messages that are meant to really be summaries of important findings, really an outline of what's important. Those were, only come to after a lot of discussion. And there's a lot of downloadable, easy to digest photos, and all of it's publicly available, diagrams, graphs, maps, etc. So when I look at, the water chapter, the agriculture chapter, I can see there's lots of trends that are national, but that are not really specific to the region. So I just wanted to share that. So a difference in the Northern Great Plains, of course, there's a lot of difference between east to west. The rurality of the region is something that we wanted to highlight in the report that's really important and different than other regions, that we have not only large rural populations that are highlighted in the nice figure 25.1 that's just meant to kind of describe an overall characteristics of the region. We also have significant populations of tribal communities in these states that are designated in the report in the Northern Great Plains. And so, some of those differences from east to west, just one that I'll make mention of is that stream flow trends are different. So in Eastern Nebraska, stream flow is projected to show some increases, or actually just the observed data in the recent past shows increases. Stream flow is a proxy for flooding, but much of the region is seeing decreases. So outside of Eastern Nebraska and the Eastern Dakotas, much of the region is seeing a decrease in stream flow, again, a proxy for flooding. And then there's a lot of trends that are somewhat similar across the region. And I won't go into all of them. The first section of the report really describes a lot of those biophysical impacts that are probably of interest to Water for Food listeners. There's a likelihood of increased intensity and frequency of drought under all emission scenarios. Summer drought is projected to be more probable than spring drought, although it's hard to think about that in the last year of spring, and the spring we're already experiencing here in 2024. Greater variability in precipitation. Across the region, there's been an increase in the heaviest 1% of rainfall days by 24%. So those are those really big soakers, and the 3, 4, 5-inch rain events increasing by 24%. Increase in the number of days above 98 degrees Fahrenheit by the mid to latter part of the century, which, when I think about what that means just from a human experience in the summer, it's not enjoyable. And also, when we think about crop production, the things I think about, that can have a lot of negative impacts. Fewer very cold days, increased wildfire potential. So those are just some of the things, kind of the biophysical impacts that the report hones in on that are specific and important to the Northern Great Plains.
And I guess I would add that the Northern Great Plains chapter really focuses on one way that I think the region may be pretty unique, and that's our dependence on natural resources for our livelihood, our natural resource based jobs and community basis in a lot of places, and our status, like we're really exporters of natural resources. So one of the things that you'll find highlighted in the Northern Great Plains chapter is really both about how communities and livelihoods are being affected both by climate change, but also by changes in policy related to climate change, and also by market changes. So, for example, in agriculture and recreation, we're seeing both positive effects and negative effects of climate change. And in some cases, that's because of what's happening in other parts of the country that's actually making agriculture and recreation more appealing in some ways in the Northern Great Plains. But then also experiencing these wide swings in variability that Andrea was talking about that makes it really challenging from year to year working in agriculture or in the recreation field. And then in the same way, obviously, our region is really dependent on the energy sector. And that sector is both being affected by changes in the climate, but also livelihoods are being affected by policies that are changing the production of energy in this country. So I think in this chapter, you kind of get a sense of how rural communities are being affected both positively and negatively by kind of the cascading a lot of different effects related to climate change in this country. And then something that we can talk, I think, a little bit more about is just really how climate change in this region is really affecting certain demographics of our region's residents. And Jesse really hit on this, the really rural, low-income immigrant populations, indigenous populations in this region, and how they're being uniquely affected by climate change.
Thanks for that. To build off of what you were just talking about with different industries and natural resources, what are some of the tensions that exist in this Northern Great Plains region that are either brought on by climate change or exacerbated by climate change?
One that we highlight in the chapter is the trade-off and tension between land use conversion, and the ecosystem services and the impacts that has. So there's been a trend over the last 2 decades or so around converting more marginal lands to more intensive crop production, and that has an impact on worsening ecosystem services of the land. And so to potentially shift that to, lower input, more perennial land uses is a solution. We're not seeing necessarily a lot of it going in that direction, but that would really require policy or economic changes to see that happen. And we also mention in the chapter more about trade-offs with energy development and agricultural lands, as well as water use needs for either agriculture, household, urban, suburban use, and energy development. So definitely, as Tonya mentioned, the natural resource livelihoods see all kinds of tensions between water, energy, agriculture, and it will take, policy change in some of these situations really to drive the adaptation versus the maladaptation that we might want to see.
Yeah, and just to build really briefly on one of Andrea's points about water use, I think some of what's highlighted in the chapter is really how the Northern Great Plains region may be attractive in the future for some climate-driven, both human migration, but also we're seeing increased forage production and a shift in, for example, livestock production in the country. And so some of those shifts may actually increase demand for water resources in the future, but we're at the same time seeing shifts in precipitation, reductions in snowpack, so changes in availability of water. So some difficult decisions ahead potentially for how we manage water in the future in this part of the country where maybe that hasn't been so much an issue in the past.
I would just briefly add too, in terms of not necessarily trade-off, but an opportunity that we mentioned in the report that other regions are seeing too, is just the extension of the growing season. So that does create an opportunity for more overwinter cover. Also, creates more warm environment for various pests. So always trade-offs, some opportunities, some potential negative.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I had thought of, a longer growing season, but I forget about pests. So you can't win them all, I guess. But you had touched on, some of the groups that are impacted especially negatively by climate change. Are there groups who might actually benefit from these changes? You mentioned the longer growing seasons and things, so I assume growers could benefit in that way, but then you have other implications that swing back the other way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, but I feel like I'm going to take a more negative approach to that. I think what we're really seeing is a disparity in who has the opportunity to benefit and who's probably going to be affected negatively. In this region, we're of course a very rural region we have a large rural population. We are the historic and continued home to multiple tribal nations, a growing number of immigrant populations tied to agriculture. And so I guess even just using agriculture as an example, I think, who benefits from those changes climate-wise in agriculture and who may be just really vulnerable to the extreme events that we're seeing at the same time is something that I think we're going to see as more prevalent. So many of our rural communities, especially more impoverished rural communities, are seeing have greater sensitivity to extreme events like droughts in the area, floods, wildfires, hail, and have not had the resources and have been left without the capacity to really respond and adapt to these hazards. And just as an example, after a flood on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 2018, the rebuilding of homes really still had not been done years later. There's in our region, we have a higher percentage of mobile homes, for example, than the national average, and which are of course more vulnerable to many environmental disasters. So there are some benefits, but so many communities in our region who are just left increasingly vulnerable to the kind of climate extremes that we're seeing at the same time. So sorry for the negative take on your question.
I'm hearing
Andrea, do you have a positive take on that question?
I'm hearing you say that the negatives outweigh the positives of climate change, and I think that's something probably that most would agree with. So now I want to talk about some of those adaptations and solutions. So how are you seeing people and processes, especially those related to water and agriculture, adapting to climate change? And which of those give you the most hope, or are you most excited about or intrigued about?
Yeah, I'll jump in again on this one. One of the groups that was highlighted in the report is one that a group of people that I've really enjoyed working on this with. So I wanted to highlight ranchers in the region who, again, in some ways, the Northern Great Plains is becoming a more desirable place to raise livestock. And I think ranchers are seeing that opportunity and also looking at some strategies for being adaptive and still really managing through the extremes that they're going to have to face. And so one of the things I've worked with ranchers quite a bit in the region is using drought planning, where there's a planned response to droughts. Ranchers sit down and think about how they're going to monitor conditions on their ranches and how they can use market dynamics, how they can use seasonal changes in forage production and their grazing plans to really manage adaptively through drought and continue to build resilience in their operations. So for me, that's a really positive and hopeful natural resource management trend that we're seeing in this region. At the community level, I think we have seen some local adaptations to challenges such as even more frequent flooding in some communities. We've seen in some communities elevating homes, changing building codes and zoning regulations to just think in a more long-term adaptive way to the future climate challenges that communities might be facing. And again, I think this is a place where some real leadership in the region has probably been seen with the tribal nations in the Northern Great Plains. There are examples like the Rosebud Sioux Tribe has been working on a number of initiatives to build resilience to climate change. The Blackfeet Nation in Montana has a climate adaptation plan. And many of these plans are really innovative and pretty advanced compared to what we might be seeing in other communities, and strategies that I think would be great to look at and think about broadly.
I would add on the adaptation front, kind of the world that I live in agriculture is often related to farmers who are interested in improving their soil health and seeing that as an adaptation strategy. And not a week or month goes by that I don't hear anecdotes about the successes that people are seeing when there are heavy rain events and improving infiltration capacity. And in the report, in the adaptation section of the Northern Great Plains chapter, we talk about how there's been a lot in the last few years of partnerships and on-farm research. That's something that Nebraska really leads the way in, but there's other entities doing that kind of work. Farmers learning from each other in how to implement soil health management practices on their farms and seeing that really as a win-win on a number of fronts. So that's one that I'm really excited about and that we highlight in the chapter. There's also examples, building on what Tonya mentioned about tribal communities. So there's a adaptation successes section about bringing back the buffalo, and groups in the Dakotas and Montana who've been working together with the tribal nations to, bring more buffalo back to the land. An example about restoring native perennial land cover with Audubon Great Plains and producers in North Dakota to support wildlife and bird populations. So there's some really positive adaptation examples. And as Tonya mentioned, the report highlights some of the ways that we are leading in partnerships in this front in the Northern Great Plains.
And Tonya, you had mentioned how we might see more livestock come into the state as a result of climate change. So I want to expand on that a little bit. If you had to predict how the economy, landscapes, or livelihoods of this region might change over the next decade or so, as a result of some of the things that are explored in this report, how do you think it might look, and how do you think it might differ from what we see now?
Andrea and I wish we knew. In addition to, that the point about the livestock comes out of some really interesting studies that are highlighted in the report that do show promise for the livestock industry in this region, and then there's some work that's really focused on continued development of renewable energy in the region and how that might shift and affect our economies, our landscapes, and livelihoods in this region, which I think is really important to to pay attention to. I think at the community level, I think rural communities may increasingly begin looking at how they themselves can start being prepared for extremes such as flooding and drought in their own communities, because that's where, the basis of many rural livelihoods have their roots, I guess, is what I would add there.
Yes, I would echo, it's impossible to predict the future. And to know how people will respond. That I would add that I feel optimistic about, at least in the agriculture space, some of the programs that are coming online with the USDA. There's a lot of emphasis around what is climate smart. There's a lot of programs that are becoming available to help farmers, apply less nitrogen. That has a lot of benefit from the standpoint of reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of agriculture and protecting nitrogen pollution. So it's programs to support farmers thinking about that, thinking about cover crops. So there's a lot of emphasis. Just I joked earlier, I just feel like every week, every month, I'm hearing more about programs like this. Nebraska actually just put out a climate action plan that will allow us to apply for EPA climate funds in the future. And a lot of the themes that we're talking about here are included in that. And so I think that there's, we can't predict how people will change, but there's, I think, programs and policies coming online that can help us move in that direction.
I really appreciate your answers there. And Jesse, now I want to turn to some of your work. You're very active in the space of climate change and human health with the Water Climate and Health Program. Before joining us here at the University of Nebraska and the Med Center, you worked with NOAA and CDC on similar work. So to start us off on this topic, can you tell us about some of the more predominant health impacts, human health impacts you see as a result of or made worse by climate change? And who do those affect the most?
Sure. Yeah, I look at climate change as a threat multiplier. So there's really nothing that isn't impacted in some way in the context of human health, whether that's, and I'll talk about a few of these I think are better examples, but everything from extreme heat, changes in water quality, water availability, impacts on air quality, extreme weather events, all of these things. And when any of these events occur, there's a potential impact on human health. And like I said before, some populations are more at risk or more vulnerable than other populations. And if you want to look at what are the direct impacts or what are the things that we can really see more easily, the first one I would have to say is extreme heat. One, extreme heat likely kills more people in the United States than any other climate or weather-related event. More than hurricanes, more than floods, more than all these other things. And that's because extreme heat events happen everywhere, and they happen multiple times every year in every location. And each time one of those events occurs, there's a possibility of a human health outcome, whether that be heat stroke, heat-related illness, or even potentially death. Last summer in Nebraska, for example, there was a major heat wave that hit, I believe it was in August, and over 300, I think it was around 300 people in Nebraska went to the hospital for heat-related illness. And that was a 3-day event. And when we're talking about this, there's more evidence than with some of these other things on how extreme heat events are increasing in frequency and intensity. We actually, my group did a study that was published last year, 2 years ago, that looked at how much our climate system has changed. And we looked at North Carolina. That was where we focused on. But you could use those exact same results and apply them anywhere else. But that's because we had access to hospital data there. But we were looking at North Carolina. We were looking at how many people go to the hospital with currently. And so we were able to develop an epidemiological model to estimate how many people go to the hospital for heat-related illness based off of temperature. And we understand our climate system pretty well. So we can run the models, the climate models that exist, without anthropogenic climate change. And so we could see what our climate system would look like with climate change, which what we are experiencing versus what we're not. Or if we removed that equation of the greenhouse gas emissions in our equation. And what we found was that somewhere between 13 to 16% of hospitalizations in North Carolina are likely resulting from anthropogenic climate change, meaning that the reason that those 13 to 16% are going to the hospital is because our Earth's climate, especially in that North Carolina region, is warmer today than it would have been without anthropogenic climate change. And so that's just tangible results showing that climate change is already having impacts on our health. There's other great examples. Wildfire seasons are getting longer. We're seeing wildfires occurring earlier in the year and becoming more intense. And some of that is due to increases in temperature and drier conditions, which has impacts on our air quality. Last year in Nebraska, for example, there were major fires that were hitting the Rockies up in Canada, which was impacting air quality here. And so we're seeing those impacts. There was a nice study that was done last year by some of our colleagues over at the University of Iowa, that one of the things that we know, car emissions is cleaner today, and it's been getting cleaner over the last 20 years, that our electrical systems, all these things are more efficient than they were previously. And so most of the places across the United States, we've been seeing a decrease in emissions. And so our air is cleaner today than previously, except in the western part of the United States. We haven't had gains in air quality in the western part of the United States because of wildfire activity, because we've seen more wildfires and they're more frequent, more intense, and they're having major impacts. For example, February in Nebraska, there was a 30 to 40,000 acre wildfire that hit the central part of Nebraska. And in Texas, we had over 1 million acres that was burned just recently. And then ticks is the other big one that I think is the easiest relationship. Ticks emerge when temperatures are warm enough for them to come out, and ticks carry a lot of diseases. Ticks are actually estimated to transmit, when we're talking about vector-borne diseases, so these are diseases that are transmitted by insects, ticks likely transmit about 80% of our vector-borne diseases in the United States. So in cases of vector-borne diseases, 80% of them are likely tick derived. And we've been seeing more tick activity over the last 20 years plus. And one of the reasons for that is climate change. Ticks are coming out earlier in the season. They're more abundant. Winters aren't as harsh as they used to be, which means that there's more opportunity for them to live over the winter season and be able to transmit viruses and diseases. And one example of that is the Lone Star tick. We've seen a northern migration of the Lone Star tick. And with that, there's that carries a virus that leads to the alpha-gal syndrome. And the alpha-gal syndrome causes people to be allergic to red meat. And we're seeing more Lone Star ticks further north, and especially in Nebraska. And so there's more opportunity for these types of diseases to be transmitted.
So some of our listeners, and myself included, are probably already surprised by some of these impacts that you mentioned, that these are things that we don't always think about are associated with climate change, but clearly are being exacerbated by that. Are there other more surprising or lesser known impacts of climate change on human health that you want to mention? Others that we might not often consider that you see in your work?
I would say the biggest thing for me is we're trying to better understand the impacts. One of the big things I work on is the impacts of drought on human health. A lot of times when we think about drought, we don't think about it in the context of human health. We think, especially here in the United States, we think about it as water resource management, agriculture, but we're actually doing a lot of really interesting research to try to understand some of these relationships on health. And we see that during drought events, we see an increase in respiratory related mortality, especially in this part of the United States, in the central part of the United States. And I think a lot of times, we don't necessarily, we're trying to do this research to better educate and inform people about what the impacts are and understand these relationships now. Because one of the things that is shown through some of our climate projections is we'll see more drought events and more potentially significant drought events in the future. And so if we can understand some of these relationships now, build better resilient health systems and public health systems to the impacts of drought, that'll help us be able to be better prepared in the future. And then the other part of it is the compounding impacts of these events. And so now we're more likely to see a flood event and then a drought event, or a heat event with a drought event. And so seeing these things kind of come together simultaneously, which means that they can have significant impacts one after another. So there's more potential buildup of impacts within communities, especially those most at-risk populations.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jesse, that it's not just one thing, it's multiple that compound our situation. So I think that leads me to my next question. As a mom of a young daughter, the idea of climate change can bring about some anxiety for me about her future, and I think for other parents too, and for the generations that come after her, like if she has children, especially when it comes to health, nutrition, and safe water. As we talk about, all these things are impacted by climate change. So there's really a lot of doom and gloom. But what can I do myself, or what are others doing to protect future generations from these negative impacts when it comes to their health? How do you see societies using the findings from this report to improve lives in the future? And how does that translate to things here in Nebraska too? So a lot of questions there, but good luck.
Yeah, no, I understand. Like I always feel like I'm the absolute worst person to invite to a party whenever they ask me about what I do for my work, because we do focus a lot on the negative. But I want people to understand that there are a lot of positives out there. And by understanding these relationships, this gives us an opportunity to be better prepared and more resilient for the future. One of the things that was in our report, or in our chapter, was that not only you, but a lot of young people, a majority of young people are really have what they call climate anxiety, nervousness about what the potential impacts are in the future. And just to kind of emphasize this point, we have the ability to address a lot of these issues. First thing you can do is change the behavior of yourself. The second thing that you can do is try to work on changing the behavior of the people around you or the communities around you. Because sometimes when you look at an issue like climate change and it's this large global issue, it can feel a little bit overwhelming at times. But the impressive thing, and I've seen this like time and time again, is the actions of people on the ground within communities. Whether it's in Omaha, Nebraska, Lincoln, Nebraska, or other small towns across Nebraska or other parts of the world, I've watched people actively engage in trying to figure out, one, how to do mitigation and improve the environment that they live in by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I've also seen people working diligently to try to reduce the impacts. Because we can understand, humans are a very resilient creature. Like, we live all over the earth. And we're exposed to everything from incredible hot temperatures to incredible cold temperatures, different precipitation patterns, etc. And so we have the ability to adapt to our systems. But the problem is our systems are moving at a little bit faster rate than what we're used to. And also what we've adapted to is now no longer the normal. And so we have to learn to adapt to these new systems, the new abnormal. And so whether that's, looking at a community that we live in and trying to identify ways to make it more livable in the future, more walkable, reducing the impacts, making sure that those populations that are most vulnerable, and looking at how can we potentially do things to help them, helping children, helping the elderly, and making sure that they're safer. And there's numerous examples around this, and we could do an entire podcast talking about that. And I don't want to go into all those details, but there's a lot that we can do within our communities to make sure that we're safe and healthy, and that we're protecting those that are most at risk now and in the future. And that's what gives me so much hope, is because we can do this. It's not rocket science. A lot of this is just kind of common sense, to be honest with you.
Well, thank you for that positive voice, Jesse. I think it's important to focus on the impact that we can have in our communities. And I also appreciate you lumping me in with young people. So thank you for that. So for the next question, I would like a take from all of you. The assessment, as you mentioned, includes full chapters on both mitigation and adaptation. And I think the success of combating climate change depends on implementing a lot of the approaches and navigating competing goals from different groups. But in your opinion, which one tactic do you think has the greatest promise to be successful given all of these nuanced factors that we've been discussing?
Well, I would start by saying I don't think there will be any one tactic. I think probably what one good takeaway from the report is the need for tactics at every level and for every sector and in different parts of the country. So I wanted to focus a little bit on adaptation. I mentioned before we're seeing more, we're learning more about the adaptation that's happening at the community level. And one of the things we've really found is that to date, adaptation it's been fairly small in scale. It's been fairly incremental. There really hasn't been enough investment in climate adaptation in this country to really get to the transformative level that we probably need to get to address our risks currently and in the future. So I think an investment in really improving capacity, understanding best approaches to climate adaptation, researching both best practices and evaluation and sharing of information among communities is an investment that I think we're really going to have to see, that I would love to see ramped up and see more in the future. And I'll add, really understand the way that adaptation can and must happen very equitably across the country. So rather than really distributing benefits of climate change and distributing the harms of climate change the way we're doing right now, that we really look at equity and justice in our approaches.
I don't know if this exactly answers your question, Frances, about tactics, but I would say in terms of messaging, the emphasis on the need for adaptation and the urgency is something I think that's really important from the report, and something that the agriculture chapter puts right front and center is just that the magnitude of the changes necessitates adaptation. So I think that that's a really important point that I'm going to continue to emphasize as I'm out in the world working with students or farmers, that we have to adapt, and we always have adapted, right? But the urgency of challenges really necessitates it. So I think that's not necessarily a tactic, but a message from the report that is really valuable.
Yeah. No, I think you both said it really well, and I don't know if there's too much that I can add. Yeah, there's not really a silver bullet to this. We really can't tackle this just with one thing. Climate change is a big issue. Obviously it's changing of the Earth's climate system. You really can't get much bigger than that. And so there's no simple fix to this. And because there's no simple fix to this, we need to be approaching this from multiple different levels. We need local participation, we need state level participation, we need federal level participation, and making sure that we're all doing that in an effective way. I think we're moving towards that. You're seeing more people becoming more integrated into understanding the impacts of climate change and trying to do climate assessments. I think there probably needs to be a little bit more uniformed approach, or maybe a little bit scripted approach on how to do that, because I think a lot of places are trying to search and figure out what it is that they need to do to try to address climate change. So I think that's something moving forward. But at the end of the day, it's not just about mitigation. And I think both Andrea and Tonya made that point, is that, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's obvious. But we also need to make sure that we're adapting to our changes in our climate system. And I think that's one of the big things that we really need to try to push forward, is understanding who are our at-risk or vulnerable populations, communities, ecosystems that are all at risk, and understanding what it is that we can do to try to build buffers within those systems to make the impacts of climate change less than if it was just completely, unstopped or unmitigated in any capacity. And there's a lot of things to do. I mean, and that's the one part about it is, we have, I think, most of the answers to the problems that we face. It's just about enacting the solutions. So that's what gives me hope, is that we actually understand how to address a lot of the issues that we face. This is complex, but it's not without answers, and we have the answers, a lot of them. And so it's just about making sure that we can enact those answers and solutions to those problems.
Well, I appreciate you, Jesse, and Tonya and Andrea participating in this discussion today. Hopefully it's inspiring for people. And I also encourage our listeners to check out the full 5th National Climate Assessment. We'll post a link to the full assessment in the show notes, along with links to recent webinars that the U.S. Global Change Research Program hosted on all of the topics that are featured in the assessment. Those kind of help people to understand how to apply that information. So thanks again, and I look forward to hearing more about your work in the future.
Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.